The session in this afternoon, first session, which is session number 3 of the conference, that is on Islamic banking as practiced by fully fledged Islamic banks, differences and similarities. You know, we have conventional banks, as before lunch we considered. We have conventional banks offering Islamic financial services, and we have fully fledged Islamic banks offering only Islamic banking services. Many people have different views on these two models, while conservative Muslims would prefer to have fully fledged Islamic banks because they feel comfortable with dealing with fully fledged Islamic banks because they know that whatever they're getting has this full Sharia compliancy behind it. When it comes to Islamic windows, many Muslims, of course there are some people who would prefer windows as well for reasons which are beyond Sharia compliancy, probably because conventional banks in certain jurisdictions happen to be more professional. Their services probably are better than Islamic banks. But by and large, okay, there is an aversion to idea of having an Islamic window. We will be focusing on Islamic, fully fledged Islamic banks only in this session. And fully fledged Islamic banks, they exist almost everywhere where Islamic banking and finance is being practiced. Starting from Malaysia, Brunei, even countries like Singapore, we have at least one fully fledged Islamic bank over there. Indonesia, and we have countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, UAE, and going to United Kingdom, and of course in United States of America, we have at least one fully fledged Islamic bank. To discuss the matters related with the practices of fully fledged Islamic banks, we have a very distinguished panel, 4 panelists, and there is a slight change on the number 3. Badlisha Abdul Ghani, who is the CEO of CIMB Islamic, which is a separately licensed Islamic bank owned by a conventional bank in Malaysia called CIMB. For health reasons, Badlisha Abdul Ghani couldn't travel to Muscat, but we have a perfect replacement for Badlisha, Khalid Baimia. He probably I start with you as an introduction. Khalid Baimia, he has worked for a number of banks and financial institutions offering Islamic financial services, especially the likes of Al Baraka banking group, and he served as CEO of 3 Islamic banks. RHB Islamic, which is a Malaysian Islamic bank, managing director, CEO of that bank. Then Hong Leong Islamic Bank, CEO of that bank, and then he was CEO of Unicorn Islamic Investment Bank. All these 3 in Malaysia. Unicorn Islamic Investment Bank since then has been renamed as Bank Al Khair Islamic Investment Bank in Malaysia. So Khalid brings a lot of first-hand insight into the practice of Islamic banking by fully fledged Islamic banks. Before him, on my first on my right-hand side is Dawood Vikri Abdullah, who has been involved in the industry in different capacities. As a consultant with Deloitte for many years, then as the CEO of Hong Leong Islamic Bank. So we have Khalid, he served for some time CEO of Hong Leong Islamic Bank, and before him, actually this was Dawood Vikri Abdullah, who was the CEO of Hong Leong Islamic Bank. And then he served as Deputy CEO of Asian Finance Bank, again in Malaysia. And now his new role is very interesting. It's part of the human resource development for Islamic financial services industry. He is Vice Chancellor of a university which specializes in Islamic finance, INCF. Tun Abdullah Badawi, in his morning speech, he referred to INCF as a body which is aiming to develop human resources for the Islamic financial services industry. So he's president and CEO of INCF, and in this capacity, he's involved in developing human resource or human capital for the Islamic financial services industry. So he would be bringing very diverse kind of analysis to the debate in this afternoon. Then we have Professor Rodney Wilson. Professor Rodney Wilson, he is very well known especially in the whole GCC, but in the wider Middle East as well. I have come up with an estimated figure after running an econometric model, which suggests that 30% of the PhDs, in this region, they were actually supervised by Rodney. Okay. So he has already pumped a lot of intellectual capital into the GCC and in the wider Middle Eastern region. His involvement in Islamic banking and finance goes back to decades. He's an academician, but he has worked on a number of consultancy projects for governments, financial institutions, and other regulatory bodies as well. And I'm sure his perspective on the practice of Islamic banking by the fully fledged Islamic banks would be very interesting. Then we have Muhammad Amin. I'm not skipping Khalid, no, he was the number one. Muhammad Amin, this is a very diverse panel, unlike the previous one where we had all the lawyers. Muhammad Amin, his area of specialization is taxation. And he specializes in the taxation of Islamic financial products and institutions, primarily the English taxation regime, but of course he has very deep insight into other taxation regimes as well. So he would bring, I believe, the perspective on the topic from the taxation viewpoint. So we have 4 very distinguished panelists to look at the topic this afternoon. Although this is a post-lunch session, but I can assure you that you would not be sleeping. Okay. So to kickstart the session, I would follow the classical model of giving 2 minutes each to the panelists to come up with their opening statement. And probably I will, if there is a need, I will ask a question if there is no statement. So Daud, starting with you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for your kind introduction, Humayun. 2 minutes is not a long time, so I'm going to speak in fairly rapid bullet points on this topic. I think something that we need to differentiate is standalone Islamic banks which are owned by Muslims or have backers which come from another Islamic bank, and standalone subsidiary Islamic banks which have conventional owners. And I think that we can debate later on. I think there's a considerable difference there, which could have implications, particularly in the retail space, in terms of retail products, with regards to cannibalization of products. And this was touched on in the session before lunch. Certainly my experience in running one of the banks that Humayun mentioned, the chairman mentioned, there was considerable issues around cannibalization. However, there are a couple of other areas that I think that we need to address during this discussion. One is how you leverage as a subsidiary of a larger organization which, I won't say owns you, but is directing you. There are certain advantages in terms of the cost for distribution, for IT investment, systems, operational costs, and similarly in the areas of human capital. And I think that if I can dwell for a moment, given my new role in developing human capital, this is one of the areas from my experience where there's always been a concern, and there will continue to be a concern. When I first took on the responsibility of running a newly formed subsidiary of a non-Muslim group, but it was a totally independent Islamic bank, the challenge was in the area of human capital, making sure you had the right people who had the right experience in the right place. And also going to a market, and this was Malaysia only 6 years ago, there was a struggle to find the right kind of human resource. Similarly, when I moved on to another bank, Asian Finance Bank, which was owned by Muslims, the majority shareholder was a major Islamic bank in Qatar. The same challenges prevailed, and this is only 4 years ago, where you were in a startup organization in one of the best developed markets for Islamic finance, but you were still struggling to find adequate cover at departmental level, the people who really understood the products, really understood the processes, really understood issues relating to risk management, relating to liquidity and so on. So I would highlight here the areas of, is the bank either retail or wholesale, issues regarding cannibalization, the advantages for distribution if you're part of a larger group, and in terms of sharing cost around IT and operations, and most importantly, having access to the right kind of human capital. And there I'll leave it and pass on for the next 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. We would definitely like to look into the two types of banks. The banks owned by Muslim shareholders and the banks owned by non-Muslim shareholders. I think this is very, very important to look into the behavior of two organizations. The likes of HSBC, for example, this is a bank predominantly owned by non-Muslims. But then we have CIMB, for example. It has CIMB Islamic, which is owned by predominantly Muslim shareholders. So trying to find the differences between the behaviors of or the attitudes of two sets of shareholders, that would be very interesting. We'll come to that one. But before that, we have the 2-minute statement from Professor Rodney Wilson.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for your kind introduction. I'd like to sort of take it in a slightly different direction that maybe we can address in terms of fully fledged Islamic banks. I think the issue is to think in terms of what are the activities which fully fledged Islamic banks are much involved in at the present time, and to draw on the experience of elsewhere in the GCC and indeed elsewhere in the Islamic world, and indeed even in the UK. And I think we have to say that most Islamic banks are, of course, retail institutions. Basically, they're taking in deposits and they're providing different types of financing. And I guess that'll be the same kind of model that Oman will follow. I guess that Nizwa Bank will basically, that'll be what it will do. Then we can kind of move beyond that, where we get a kind of move by Islamic banks into private wealth management, for example, or simply offering Islamic funds. Again, we have some Islamic banks that have moved into that area from being basically retail banks, still retail, but for clients of high net worth as well as clients of less well off. So it's a kind of move a little bit towards a universal type of banking model for Islamic banks, but only some have done it. Others have not. You know, for example, Al Rajhi in Saudi Arabia, they have lots of funds that they offer. They do some wealth management. Dubai Islamic Bank does some wealth management. They don't have very many funds. So we can look at different experiences, basically, from different banks. Then we can go beyond that into Islamic investment banking. Now, there's very little, really. There's very few Islamic banks, I think, which you could describe as basically having an investment banking capability. And I think this is, again, what this kind of relates to are things like sukuk arranging and issuance, basically. And obviously that's something which is core to Islamic investment banking. But the issue is in Oman here, that really couldn't really be done by a new Islamic bank that's primarily retail. It would have to basically do it, I guess, in partnership with either another larger Islamic bank that's already been involved in this, or a conventional bank. So there's these sort of 3 different areas, really, I think. And a 4th area is Islamic microfinance. Now, again, you probably want to have a separate institution for that. Again, fully fledged Islamic bank, or fully fledged Islamic financial institution, but not the retail bank trying to do that, because it's a different type of business. So I guess what I'm saying is you have fully fledged Islamic banks, but they're doing different types of things. Firstly, retail. Secondly, basically moving on into offering funds, fund management, this kind of area, which is a separate area. Maybe it should be done by a separate institution. Then Islamic investment banking, should that be done by a universal Islamic bank, or alternatively best done by a different, more specialized institution? And then again, Islamic microfinance, again, a different type of activity, might be better done by a different institution. So I guess what I'm saying is you don't want one fully fledged Islamic bank, you might need different types of fully fledged Islamic banks to be providing these kind of functions. Thank you very much.
That's very good. Khalid?
I look at the question of managing Islamic bank versus managing conventional bank. Managing conventional bank and managing Islamic bank are very similar up to a certain extent. But once you come into full-fledged Islamic bank management, there are many other things that you discover that you would never have discovered when you were in a conventional bank management. For example, you discover that your choices of IT is very limited. You cannot go out and find 500 suppliers for IT. You may be lucky if you find 3 suppliers of IT. So that becomes an issue, or that limits your ability to do things. If you also look at the regulators who are used to conventional banking regulations, you have a greater difficulty in educating them on how they should be looking at you rather than looking at the conventional bank, because everything that they are familiar with is the conventional bank, and they want to apply the same standard to you. That's the second part that I find very difficult in that. The third part also that becomes very difficult is the cost of delivery. Islamic banks have a higher cost of delivery of products than a conventional bank, maybe because of economies of scale, maybe because of the startup timing differences in there, maybe because of the nature of the product, because you take longer time to educate the customer with the product than you would do with a customer. If you tell a conventional bank customer it's a current account, they understand. If you try and tell the Islamic customer this is a Mudaraba current account, then he wouldn't understand. You have to go through the whole thing in there. So those kinds of things have extra challenges that you face when you're managing Islamic bank. And the last part is, God forbid, if you have the same board of directors in conventional versus Islamic, then you're doomed, because everything is benchmarked against the conventional bank and say, but they told us differently, so why are you different? Then you're doomed totally in there, because there isn't any ability to differentiate that this is a totally different business than the conventional banking business.
Excellent. I think that this is very good perspective. In managing an Islamic bank is very, very different from managing a conventional bank. And then, I think that this is a point we will come back to. It goes to the board of directors, shareholders. I think that this is very, very important, given that probably in Oman, for some time, the Windows model would be very popular. So of course, we have a fully fledged Islamic bank already, and we hope that there will be some other applications as well for fully fledged Islamic banks. But many other conventional banks, they have either they are going to start very soon their Islamic